the summer heat of the Arabian desert, more than 14 centuries ago, a text began to take shape that would eventually be recited, word for word, by more human beings than any other piece of literature in history. No printing press existed, no digital archive, no central library to guard the only copy, and yet, historians agree on something remarkable. The text in circulation today matches, almost letter for letter, manuscripts written within a generation of its origin. How is that possible? How does any document survive 1,400 years of empires rising and falling, of fires and floods and wars, without drifting into 1,000 different versions, the way so many ancient texts have? That is the question this documentary sets out to answer, not through assumption, but through evidence. For centuries, scholars, historians, and skeptics alike have been drawn to this puzzle. Every other major religious text from the ancient world exists today in multiple variant forms, pieced together from manuscripts written decades or centuries after the events they describe, often disagreeing with one another in ways both small and significant. The Qur'an is frequently cited, even by non-Muslim historians of textual transmission, as an unusual case. That uniqueness is not a matter of faith alone. It is something that can be tested against physical manuscripts, radiocarbon dating, and the written record of early Islamic history. This is why the question of the Qur'an's preservation still matters today, not just to over 1 billion Muslims who recite it daily, but to historians of religion, archivists, and anyone curious about how information survived in the ancient world. To understand how this text was protected, we have to first understand the world it was born into. 7th century Arabia was not a place of libraries and scriptoriums. It was a place where memory was currency. The Arabian Peninsula, particularly among the tribes of the Hijaz, had developed one of the most sophisticated oral cultures in human history. Poetry competitions were held at markets like Ukaz, where poets would recite thousands of lines from memory, and audiences would judge, correct, and remember every syllable. Genealogies stretching back dozens of generations were memorized and passed down without a single written record. This was a society trained, almost athletically, in the discipline of precise memorization. When the Qur'an began to be revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, beginning around 610 CE, it entered a culture uniquely equipped to preserve it exactly as it was heard. But memorization alone is not what Islamic tradition describes. From the very beginning, according to early Islamic sources, the Prophet Muhammad instructed companions to write down each revelation as it came. Men known as the scribes of revelation, among them Zayd ibn Thabit, Ubay ibn Ka'b, and others, recorded verses on whatever materials were available at the time: flattened palm leaf stalks, thin white stones, pieces of leather, and the shoulder blades of animals. This dual system, oral memorization running alongside written recording, is central to how Muslims and historians alike explain the text's stability. It was never memory alone, and it was never writing alone. The two safeguarded each other, because a written page can be checked against a living memory, and a memory can be checked against a written page. By the time of the Prophet's death in 632 CE, thousands of his companions had memorized portions of the Qur'an, and a number of them, historical sources suggest, had memorized the entire text. This was not unusual for a society that placed such high value on recitation. But history moved quickly, and moved violently. Within a year of the Prophet's death, the new Muslim community faced a series of wars known as the Ridda Wars, fought against tribes that broke away from the young Islamic State. One of the deadliest of these conflicts was the Battle of Yamama, fought in 633 CE, where a large number of Muslim fighters were killed. Among them, according to early historical accounts, dozens of men who had memorized the Qur'an in its entirety. This loss alarmed the companions still living. It was, according to the traditional account preserved by early Muslim historians, the companion Umar ibn al-Khattab who approached the first caliph, Abu Bakr, with a warning.
If more of these memorizers were to die in future battles, portions of the Qur'an could be lost forever, since at that point, the revelation existed scattered across the memories of many people and the fragments of material a handful of scribes had written. Abu Bakr, initially hesitant to do something the Prophet himself had not directly ordered, was eventually persuaded of the necessity.
He commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit, one of the primary scribes during the Prophet's lifetime, to lead the effort of compiling the Qur'an into a single, complete, physical collection. What makes this compilation historically significant is the method Zayd is reported to have used. According to early Islamic historical accounts, he did not rely on his own memory alone, extraordinary as it was. He cross-checked every verse against both the written fragments that existed from the Prophet's lifetime and the testimony of other companions who had memorized the same passages, reportedly requiring at least 2 independent witnesses for each portion before it was accepted into the compiled text. This was, in effect, an early form of textual verification, built on redundancy. A single point of failure, one person's faulty memory, or one damaged page, could not alter the collection, because everything had to be independently confirmed. The resulting compiled manuscript was kept in the possession of Abu Bakr, then passed to the second caliph, Umar, and finally entrusted to Umar's daughter, Hafsa, who had also memorized the Qur'an completely. The next major chapter in this story unfolds roughly 2 decades later, during the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan, around 650 CE. By this time, the Islamic State had expanded dramatically, stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. Muslim armies and settlers came from many different regions, and with that expansion came something the early community had not anticipated: regional differences in how the Qur'an was being recited. These differences were largely a matter of dialect and pronunciation, reflecting the reality that Arabic itself contained multiple recognized dialects at the time of revelation, some of which the Qur'an had been permitted to accommodate for ease of recitation across tribes. But as these variations spread across a growing empire, disputes began to emerge among soldiers and new converts about whose recitation was correct. According to the historical accounts recorded by early Muslim historians, such as al-Bukhari, it was a companion named Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman who, after witnessing these disputes while campaigning in Armenia and Azerbaijan, returned to Uthman, deeply concerned that the community was heading toward the kind of scriptural fragmentation that had affected earlier religious communities. Uthman responded decisively. He requested the original compiled manuscript from Hafsa and commissioned a committee, again led by Zayd ibn Thabit, to produce several standardized master copies. These master copies were then sent to the major cities of the expanding Islamic world, including Mecca, Kufa, Basra, and Damascus, along with an instruction that any other written materials containing variant Quranic text should be set aside in favor of this standardized version. This is often referred to by historians as the Uthmanic recension, and it represents the point at which the Quranic text, as a physical written document, became unified across the entire Islamic world. This is where oral tradition alone stops being the only evidence we have, and physical, testable, scientific evidence enters the story. In the years since, archaeologists and manuscript historians have uncovered and studied Quranic manuscripts that date to this earliest period of Islamic history, and their findings offer a rare opportunity: the chance to compare what the earliest written copies actually say against the Quran recited and printed today. One of the most significant discoveries came in 1972, during renovation work on the Great Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen. Workers found a hidden storage space containing tens of thousands of fragments of parchment, many of them extremely old Quranic manuscripts that had been retired from use and stored away, following an old Islamic tradition of not discarding sacred texts. Among these fragments was what researchers now call the Sana'a palimpsest, a manuscript where an earlier layer of text had been washed off and written over, a common practice with expensive parchment in the ancient world. Using ultraviolet imaging, German researcher Gerd Puin and later scholars were able to read the lower, erased layer beneath the visible text. Radiocarbon analysis conducted on this lower text places it among the oldest Quranic material known to survive, likely written within a couple of decades of the Prophet's death. Researchers who have studied this palimpsest, including Western academics not writing from a position of religious conviction, have noted that, while it shows some differences in verse ordering and minor wording, consistent with a text that predates the Uthmanic standardization, the content itself remains recognizably and substantially the same Quran recited today, with no missing chapters, no altered theology, and no verses absent from the standard text. A second major discovery came from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. In 2015, researchers examining manuscript fragments that had been misfiled for decades within a larger collection identified 2 leaves of a Quranic manuscript written in an early form of Arabic script known as Hijazi. Radiocarbon dating conducted at the University of Oxford placed the parchment with 95.4% accuracy within a range of 568 to 645 CE, meaning the animal from which the parchment was made lived and died sometime within or very close to the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself. This finding attracted global academic attention precisely because it pushed the physical evidence for a written Quran closer to the time of revelation than almost any manuscript previously studied. Subsequent examination revealed that these leaves were, in fact, part of the same manuscript as another set of fragments held in Paris, together forming one of the earliest known, nearly complete Quranic manuscripts, now sometimes referred to in scholarship as the Birmingham Paris manuscript. Its text, when compared against the modern standard Quran, matches with only the kind of minor orthographic variation expected of any handwritten document from a period before standardized spelling conventions existed. It's important, in the interest of historical honesty, to acknowledge that not every scholar in the field of early Islamic history has reached identical conclusions. A number of Western academics, sometimes referred to as revisionist historians, including figures like John Wansbrough and Patricia Crone, writing in the late 20th century, proposed theories suggesting that the Quran's text may have crystallized later than traditional Islamic accounts describe, developing over a longer period through a more gradual process. These theories generated significant academic debate. However, in the decades since those theories were first proposed, the discovery and radiocarbon dating of manuscripts like the Birmingham Paris leaves and the Sana'a palimpsest have been widely cited by manuscript specialists as strong physical evidence supporting the earlier, traditional timeline, and many scholars in the field, including some who were initially sympathetic to revisionist approaches, have since revised their positions considerably. This remains an active area of academic research, and reputable historians continue to examine new manuscript finds as they surface, but the trend of physical evidence over the last several decades has moved consistently in one direction, toward confirming that the Quran's text was fixed remarkably early and remarkably faithfully. Beyond parchment and ink, there is a second, living form of preservation that has run parallel to the written record for 14 centuries, and in many ways, it is the more extraordinary of the two. This is the unbroken chain of oral memorization, known in Arabic as hifz. From the first generation of companions who memorized the Quran directly from the Prophet, through unbroken chains of teacher and student stretching across every century since, the practice of memorizing the entire Quran, all 114 chapters, has continued without interruption anywhere in the Muslim world. Today, researchers estimate that millions of people worldwide have memorized the Quran in its entirety, a number that by some estimates may exceed 10 million people alive today, spread across nearly every country on earth, reciting the same text from memory, often taught through methods that require a student's recitation to be checked syllable by syllable against a certified teacher's own memorized chain, going back generation by generation to early Islamic scholars. This creates something textual historians describe as a form of built-in redundancy, almost unmatched in the ancient or medieval world. Even in a hypothetical scenario where every physical manuscript of the Quran were destroyed,
The text could, in principle, be reconstructed from the memories of the millions of people who have memorized it, because those memorized versions across vastly different regions, from Indonesia to Morocco to the United States, are checked against the same written standard and consistently match one another, word for word. It is this convergence of two independent systems, one written and physically verifiable through manuscripts and radiocarbon dating, the other oral and verifiable through the sheer scale and consistency of memorization across cultures and centuries, that historians point to when explaining why the Quran's transmission stands out as a distinct case study in the history of ancient texts.
So how was the Quran preserved for 1400 years? The historical evidence points to a layered answer, not a single simple one. It was preserved because it emerged in a culture that had already mastered the art of precise oral transmission. It was preserved because it was written down during the lifetime of the person who first recited it, not decades or centuries later. It was preserved because a small group of the Prophet's companions, in the years immediately following his death, moved deliberately and carefully to compile it into a single, verified text, cross-checking memory against manuscript. It was preserved because Uthman ibn Affan recognized the danger of fragmentation early enough to standardize the text before an expanding empire could pull it into competing versions. And it has continued to be preserved because millions of people, generation after generation, have chosen to carry it not on parchment, but within themselves. Modern manuscript science, radiocarbon dating, ultraviolet imaging, and the careful comparative work of historians, both Muslim and non-Muslim, have not disproven this account. If anything, over the last half-century, they have given it increasingly solid physical ground to stand on. The pages found hidden in a Yemeni mosque and the leaves misfiled for decades in a British university library were not written to prove anything to future generations. They were simply used, worn, and set aside, the ordinary residue of a text being lived with century after century. And when historians finally opened them, tested them, and read them, they found the same words that a child in Jakarta, a grandmother in Cairo, and a student in Chicago recite today. That, perhaps, is the most striking part of the story. Not that a text survived for 1400 years, but that it survived essentially unchanged, verified not by a single guardian or a single library, but by an entire civilization that decided, deliberately and repeatedly, across generations, that this was worth remembering exactly right. If you found this journey through history as compelling as we did putting it together, consider subscribing for more evidence-based documentaries exploring the history behind the world's most enduring texts and traditions.